All right, good afternoon, everybody. We have a jam-packed webinar, so we are going to get started right on time. And my name is Joy Page. I am the Director of Policy, Renewable Energy Policy at Defenders of Wildlife. And on behalf of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Defenders of Wildlife, we welcome you to our second webinar, Federal and State Perspectives on Environmental Review of Wind, Energy, and Wildlife. And this is a part of a 9-part series, which we kicked off last Thursday. And so first, we're going to do some quick housekeeping. You will be muted throughout the webinar, but you can communicate with us through the questions feature. If you are having audio issues, try switching from computer audio to the phone call option to dial in. And we added some additional supports there. I'm going to run through some quick webinar norms as well. Please assume positive intent. But again, if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to us. And we ask that you actively engage throughout the webinar and send us your questions. To ensure everyone can easily participate and engage, we are going to do our best to avoid acronyms. But if there are any terms that you don't understand, please feel free to reach out to us. And please use the questions feature to answer questions. For any questions that we don't get through, during this webinar, there will be a Q&A document that is released after. As I mentioned, this is the second of a 9-part webinar series. We still have several more to go, 7 more after this. So make sure that you keep up to date with your email. And if you want to make sure that you're on our updates, please feel free to reach out to Pasha. Her email is below, or send us a chat through the questions feature on the GoToWebinar platform. All right, well, as I mentioned, we do have a jam-packed webinar, and this webinar will generally be in 2 parts. So first, we're going to hear from 3 speakers. We're going to start with Rachel London, who's a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is going to give us an overview of the wind energy guidelines. Then we'll shift to Jessica Wilkinson, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Energy and Infrastructure at the Nature Conservancy. And she is going to share with us the results of a wind sighting survey that was conducted by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Then she'll pass it off to Michael Spearschneider, who is Senior Director of Permitting Policy and Environmental Affairs at the American Wind Energy Association. And he's going to give us the industry's perspective on environmental review. From there, we're going to have a short Q&A. And then we're going to move on to our state perspectives panel, which I'll give you an update on then. To save time, I'm not going to read bios, but this is a really impressive set of folks. So I really encourage you to look at the bio and photo handout that's provided for you on the GoToWebinar platform. So I think with that, I've covered everything, and I'm going to shift it off to Rachel London. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Joy. So I'm just, I guess, waiting for a pop-up to share my screen. There we go. And are you seeing my slide and presentation view?
We sure are.
All right. So, well, thank you, Joy. I'm just going to jump right in with a quick overview of our role in the services role in wind energy development. And it might seem a little bit basic, but I'm going to start with our mission, and it's working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants for the continuing benefit of the American people. So in the context of wind energy, what this means is that we're working with project proponents to first avoid and then to minimize impacts to wildlife and our habitats. And we're also working to ensure compliance with federal wildlife laws. So the wildlife laws that typically come into play at a wind energy facility are the Endangered Species Act, the Wildlife Protection Act, and the MBTA. These laws, in part, regulate take of protected species, and so they may not come into play at a wind energy facility unless the project proponent is either seeking a permit for a take or until take has occurred. So that really doesn't get us to our mission here to conserve, protect, and enhance. And it also doesn't really provide us with the opportunity to do that advanced work to first avoid and then minimize adverse effects. And so that's where project planning comes in, and that's sort of a traditional role of the Ecological Services Field Office within the Fish and Wildlife Service. What we were missing was a framework to facilitate that working together to avoid and minimize that happens up front. So there was a need there. And we also recognized the need to address the species that may not be listed, but are impacted by wind. And I think that we're not alone in wanting to ensure that we're not listing more species in the future because of impacts from wind energy development. So what we did was we established a federal advisory committee under the Federal Advisory Committee Act back in 2007. The committee had a wide range of representation of all of the main stakeholders that are engaged in wind and wildlife in the United States. They worked for 3 years together, a set of recommendations, and not only recommendations, they actually ended up drafting. They recommended the service adopt, and not only did they do that, they agreed to them by consensus. And I think it was just due to the fact that the committee members were really effective at not only advocating for the needs and goals of their respective organizations, but they also took a lot of time to listen to one another and learn and understand where each organization was coming from. So you can see here in that last bullet, we then took 2 years before we did ultimately finalize our guidelines, the land-based wind energy guidelines. And in that 2 years, the service did a lot of internal vetting. We had a team of field office staff that also included regional staff from all programs that would be affected by implementation of the guidelines. So the Office of Law Enforcement, Migratory Birds, Endangered Species. And it went all the way up to the Secretary, went all the way up through the Department of Interior. And also during this time, we published them in the Federal Register for public comment. So I know I have a short amount of time and I'm really focused on this one slide, but I just really wanted to emphasize for anybody who's not really familiar with the background of these guidelines, where they came from, that these were not written by the service. They were actually put together by all of the main stakeholders who are engaged in wind and wildlife issues in the US, and that they've been really heavily vetted and they have wide support. And so I just think that's pretty, it's not very common for a federal guidance to come through this route. So I briefly described sort of our need at the beginning, what we were missing to help us get through that early engagement. And the wind energy guidelines, oh, and I'm sorry for the acronym, WEG stands for Wind Energy Guidelines. And what they do to get us there is they provide us with a process that's clearly defined, it's based in science, it sets out expectations of everybody's roles and responsibilities. And although the guidelines are designed to be adaptable, it sets some consistency in place in terms of how we plan and review projects. So all these things are good for wind energy companies, but they also help the service get to our mission and ultimately benefit our conservation goals. The second bullet is really important, and I gave it its own bullet, just the word voluntary, to remind folks that the guidelines are voluntary. So the service doesn't issue permits or otherwise authorize in any way construction of wind energy projects. And what that means is that because they're voluntary, the developer decides whether to use the guidelines and also how they're going to use them. So that means that inherently there will be some variability in how the guidelines are applied from site to site, and that's okay. They are voluntary. There may even be variability in how the service approaches the guidelines from field office to field office. So because they're voluntary, if a developer voluntarily chooses to adhere to the guidelines, and I want to note that adherence to the guidelines is a term of art that's described on page 6 in the guidelines. What that means is that the developer or operator has identified and implemented reasonable and effective measures to avoid the take of any species of concern that have been identified, and that they do that in communication with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And also, the developer is responsible for documenting how they've adhered to the guidelines, including how they've communicated with the service. So again, if you want to check that out in further detail, that's on page 6 in the guidelines. And because communication and documentation is so key, I also want to point folks to page 5 of the Wind Energy Guidelines. There's a suggested communications protocol that may get overlooked. It's sort of in the front matter of the document, but it's a great tool that I urge you to bring to an early meeting. And what it does is it goes tier by tier and describes what is expected. So what is the role of the developer and of the service? What information are we going to share? And how are we going to coordinate with one another? And it's just a great idea to get that done at the beginning and start off with everybody on the same page on how that communication is going to happen. And one last note on an overview, should you, in the course of going through the guidelines, identify any listed species protected by the Endangered Species Act or Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, for example, then adherence to the guidelines doesn't check the box for those laws. You must go into the regulatory process outlined for those species. So just a couple minutes left. I'm trying to be mindful of time, so I just did a very quick slide here to give a broad brush overview of the guidelines themselves. And so what's presented in the document is a tiered approach to risk assessment. So it's a series of 5 tiers, each builds off of the last. And the first 3 you see here, tiers 1 through 3, are pre-construction, and then tiers 4 and 5 are post-construction. And basically, you're starting out at 1 with a really broad general look at publicly available information, and as you progress, you're getting more and more detailed, answering more specific questions, and trying to get a more descriptive understanding of what's happening on the ground and how you can use that information to improve your project. So within each tier, as you're going through the document, you're presented with a series of questions, and those questions are designed to gather the information that you would need to assess risk and figure out whether or not you're going to move on to the next tier. You also, within each tier, have a set of what are referred to as study design considerations or protocol considerations, depending on the tier. And you're given some examples of methods and metrics, tools that are available to help you answer the questions and maybe provide some examples. I'll note that
Rachel?
Yeah?
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. It doesn't look like your slide has advanced for the audience.
Oh, sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry about that. I haven't gotten the handle of 2 screens and toggling through both of them. Okay, so I'm probably doing it wrong anyway. So yes, so let's see. Yes, so I just wanted to note that the guidelines they're 8 years old. Actually, the same. My son was born the month after they were published, so that's how I keep track of the age. But there's certainly a lot of new information that's available, and so what's in here is a suggestion. They're what were recommended at the time, and we just support the use of best available science. And I just wanted to note that. At the end of each tier, you're then presented with decision points. And so these are some questions that are designed to help you figure out whether or not you're ready to move on, whether there's some unsurmountable issues that are going to have you abandon a site that's under consideration, or whether you just need to go advance to the next tier and collect more data. If you reach those decision points and you can't make a clear decision, then that's a clue that you need to go back to those questions within the tier and collect more data. And so that's all that I had here. I kind of ended at that slide. So I guess now we'll do questions in a little bit, and I will introduce Jessica Wilkinson with the Nature Conservancy and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was great. So Jessica Wilkinson here with the Nature Conservancy. I was asked to give an overview today of a survey that was undertaken last year under the auspices of a working group that was established by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee. So Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, I'll probably use the acronym AFWA. They have a policy committee, an Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee, and that committee established a working group to administer that survey. Although I'm at the Nature Conservancy, I'm sharing the summary of the survey findings as a member. Nature Conservancy is a member of the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee, and I co-chaired the working group that developed and administered the survey. And unfortunately, the AFWA staff person who supports the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee, Mark Humpert, wasn't able to join us today. Next slide. So the work group was formed to design and administer a survey of all state fish and wildlife agencies to better understand their concerns, their needs, and their interests related to wind energy siting and wildlife conservation. Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency has a point of contact for all 50 state wildlife agencies, and those are the people who received the survey, and all of the results are input that was received from state fish and wildlife agencies. The survey was carried out last summer of 2019, and the results of the survey were shared with the full committee in the fall of 2019. The committee then asked the working group to share put together a summary report of the findings and share some recommendations. I am just going to give you a very cursory high-level overview of the survey findings. The full deck that has all the survey findings and the summary report are all available on the AFWA Energy and Wildlife Committee, Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee website. If you go to AFWA and then look at the Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee, you can see the full survey results and the summary report on that page. So I highly encourage folks to take a look at that if you are interested in digging a little deeper. Next slide. So this was the makeup of the state wind wildlife assessment work group at the time the survey was carried out. As you can see, the members of the work group included representatives from a very geographically diverse set of states and a few NGOs. I would note that after the survey was completed, the policy committee asked the work group to then kind of tackle some of the recommendations that came out of the report. And the work group composition has changed a little bit, but since I was asked to talk about the survey and the survey results, I wanted to share with you the work group that was involved in that portion of the project. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of which state fish and wildlife agencies responded to the survey. As you can see, we received responses from 39 state wildlife agencies. At the time, these 39 states represented 93% of the total megawatts of wind capacity in the U.S. Those are megawatts currently installed, under construction, or in advanced stages of development. So they got really great representation. Of the 39 states that responded, you'll also see that some of those, in particular in the Southeast, include states that have very little to virtually no installed capacity. So you'll see there's a big variation from state to state in how much experience they have with wind energy siting. But as you can see, we got a great representation of those states that have the significant amount, the majority of installed capacity in the U.S. or installed under construction or in advanced stages. Next slide. The survey, pretty in-depth. It included 44 questions. These are the very broad categories under which those questions fall. Again, I do not have enough time to go into all of the different topic areas or even every question underneath these different categories. And again, I recommend that folks, if I don't touch on one of these areas that you're interested in, please take a look at the survey results and the summary report. So now I'm going to just give you a high-level overview of some of the findings that were pulled together through the survey. Next slide. So state fish and wildlife agencies were asked to share what risks they feel are most significant to wildlife and habitat from wind energy sighting. And state fish and wildlife agencies reported that they feel that the most significant risks to wildlife and habitat are: number one, direct mortality from collisions; number two, habitat fragmentation; and three, cumulative impacts. State fish and wildlife agencies were also asked how well they feel that current research is addressing these different types of wind and wildlife issues. And as you can see, state fish and wildlife agencies reported that they feel that current wind wildlife research is doing a decent job of directing attention and research to direct impacts, a moderately good job of addressing indirect impacts, and a poor job of addressing cumulative impacts to wildlife and habitat. Next. Several questions were posed to state fish and wildlife agencies about the degree to which they are consulted by wind developers as projects are being developed. So from the very early stages of prospecting into full operation, along that continuum of project development. I think you advanced one too many. You back a slide?
One more, Jessica, I'm sorry. Is this good?
Yeah. So anyway, there were a series of questions asking state fish and wildlife agencies whether they felt that they're consulted by developers during the process, how frequently they were consulted, how much information on potential projects was shared with them at different stages. And what I'm going to share with you right now is kind of generally the take-home messages from this portion of the survey. So while state fish and wildlife agencies generally felt the developers consulted with them, developers and their consultants consulted with them most of the time, they also felt that the frequency and quality of that consultation, how frequently they are consulted, how much information is requested of them, that can vary significantly depending on the specific developer, and it's highly variable from developer to developer. I think another interesting thing that the state fish and wildlife agencies reported was that they felt that they received very little information early on in the project siting process during the prospect stages where developers are just starting to kind of explore potential sites, and the amount of information that they receive increases as the project moves along in the project siting. And then while developers frequently, or as state fish and wildlife agencies reported, that while developers frequently request information from them on regulated species, such as some of the species that are regulated under the authorities that Rachel highlighted, like NDPA and ESA, they infrequently request information on other types of resources that are identified in the wind energy guidelines, such as areas of intact habitat that are sensitive to the effects of fragmentation. Next slide. So we also asked state fish and wildlife agencies about the kinds of authorities or mechanisms that exist in their states to encourage, in a voluntary manner, or require, in a regulatory manner, consultation with their agencies as projects are being developed. So what degree, the questions are about what degree state fish and wildlife agencies have authority to comment upon wind energy siting, or they have some non-regulatory mechanisms to encourage developers to consult with them as projects are being identified and developed. So none of the states that reported, that gave us feedback, reported that they have any direct regulatory authority over wind siting. As you can see, there are a bunch of states that have kind of indirect authorities. So in some cases, the state boards of public utilities or public utility commissions are receiving information about projects as they're being developed. And in some of those cases, those PUCs or BPUs are required to get input from the state fish and wildlife agencies. So it's kind of an indirect way that state fish and wildlife agencies have an opportunity to provide their expert opinion on impacts to fish, wildlife, and habitat. But as you can see, a small portion of states that have those regulatory authorities, even the indirect ones, felt that they were very effective in supporting good siting decisions. A much bigger percentage of states reported that they have non-regulatory mechanisms to encourage developers to consult with them, such as state versions of the wind energy guidelines or other kinds of non-regulatory mechanisms. However, a small portion of those states felt that these non-regulatory authorities have been very effective in supporting good siting decisions. So not a lot of states have good regulatory mechanisms. Those that do exist, the Fish and Wildlife agencies felt that they haven't been very super effective. A lot of them have non-regulatory mechanisms, and some of those they have reported they do not feel are very effective at supporting good siting decisions. Next slide. State Fish and Wildlife agencies, however, overwhelmingly reported that they feel that there are ways that early consultation with their agencies could be improved. So generally speaking, very positive and optimistic view that there are ways to improve the coordination and consultation with state fish and wildlife agencies as projects go from early scoping to development. And we asked state fish and wildlife agencies what mechanisms they feel have been most effective at ensuring early consideration of species and habitat in wind siting. So this is the state fish and wildlife agencies, their opinion about what they feel would be most effective and better ensuring that they're consulted early on in the process. And the top things that they reported back are the having other agencies that are providing more direct oversight of decisions to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Agency. So they felt that that would be a very effective mechanism. So building in consultation with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. The second thing they reported was improved and more consistent application of the federal wind energy guidelines. Overwhelmingly, State Fish and Wildlife agencies were very supportive of the wind energy guidelines and have a lot of faith in them. But generally speaking, they reported that they felt that there is room for improvement in how the federal wind energy guidelines are applied and opportunities for improvement in how consistently they are applied. And then the final thing that they thought would be effective are state regulations.
Jessica, can you wrap this up in the next minute?
Yep, last slide.
All right, we'll get there.
So the work group made a series of recommendations as well. And again, you can dig into these a lot more in the full report and the slide deck. The one that I will just highlight, since it's appropriate, apropos of this webinar series, is State Fish and Wildlife agencies felt there was a lot of merit to them working together to identify science priorities, some of the research needs that they have, and sharing those with partners to encourage further investment in those areas where they felt that more research was needed. So lots more to dig into, and I encourage folks to dig into the full results and the report if you are interested. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Michael, I think you're on mute. And great, we see your slide.
You can see my slides.
We see your PowerPoint in, right. But it's not yet in slideshow view.
Oh. Great. Help me figure out how to put it in slideshow view. Is that it?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, and I'm pleased to be here, part of this panel, offer our industry perspective on the on environmental review. And short time here, hopefully can get through this very quickly. We just want to convey first and foremost that the industry is committed to effective, efficient, practical environmental review. Of course, working in close coordination with federal and state agencies as well as conservation community. So really appreciate the work that Jessica just presented, and think it's a really great jumping off point for discussion. And hopefully we share the same amount of optimism that we can do some things, hopefully with some pretty simple things to improve some of the implementation of the WEGs, and particularly as it revolves around the interaction with state agencies. So what I want to do today, this is again, hopefully pretty quick in the time I have. The way I was looking at this was maybe some bookends around the environmental review and general wildlife and habitat issues for the wind industry. One being the sort of initial review encapsulated by the wind industry guidelines, tier 1, tier 2, and then eventually tier 3. And then at the back end, I think it's an important to keep in the conversation is the benefits that do come out of the wind industry and renewable industry. It's essentially why we're here. So we do want to keep that a part of the discussion. So before we get into that, I think it's worth the note. We can't get into it too much right now, but siting is complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that has to happen for a project to be viable and to be financeable. And developers and wind companies are doing their best to find sites that kind of come together. All of these things come together. Wildlife and habitat are certainly one of those issues, and an important one of those issues. And to that point, have this thing called the wind energy guidelines to help companies and agencies kind of work through that. So again, just wanted to kind of make that point, and don't want this as a sort of throwaway. Don't worry about it. Wildlife and habitat is kind of secondary, but that it's part of a big picture, and it's important to keep that view. So the wind energy guidelines, Rachel did a great job going over this. I think it's a slight shout out maybe in the NWCC research meeting coming up. Rachel and I will be working on a session that goes a little bit more in depth into the wind energy guidelines. But it is, this decision framework. It is the tiered process. It's been designed in a way. It was put together by that group in a way to really kind of advance these conservation concepts. And one line from the wind energy guidelines that I think encapsulates a lot of that is that they were the wind energy. The purpose of them is that when used in concert with appropriate regulatory tools, the WEGs form the best practical approach for conserving species of concern. That's a really important point. That, along with, as Rachel mentioned, it's voluntary. This isn't in place of some of the policies and regulations that are in place already at the national and state levels. But it really is, in a way, going above and beyond. And I think that's the way a lot of us in the wind industry look at that, and hope to strive to continue those efforts. It is important to kind of look at the scope and scale. There is, and again, it's part of the WEGs. Not every project's the same, not every developer is the same, not every state agency is the same, not every Fish and Wildlife Service field office is the same, and there's all sorts of different interest and factors as you go through these projects. And really, that's when we talk about efficiency and practicality. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's something that ideally our developers are working with their partners at the agencies and the conservation community to find the best answer for these projects. And so a little bit of variability is expected, and we think is efficient in that way. So the main question then is maybe, well, do they work? Kind of get that a lot. And, the answer is, there's no hard qualitative or quantitative concrete answer, but we can look at it in a couple of different ways. One of them is, are they being adopted? Are they being embraced by the industry? And then sort of how are they being placed into kind of how companies do their work? On both of those perspectives, I think there's a lot of positives to take away from that. Very, very high degree of adaptivity. As Rachel said, it may look different. I think Jessica mentioned this too. It may look different company, but a vast majority of the companies that we work with anyway are using the WEGs. They are also using consultants that are versed in the WEGs as well, and getting the advice and direction from those consultants as they go through the environmental review process. So from that standpoint, a high degree of success. From the standpoint of, okay, well, how does that look? It's not just well, there's the WEGs and we'll do our best, but these things are ingrained in the way that companies develop projects. So developers will have mechanisms for looking at transmission issues, at community acceptance issues, at all of those other issues on that slide before. And they do have ingrained in that training, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, of the development staff, of their permitting teams, and so that the WEGs, that they're thinking about the environmental reviews as they're thinking about all of the other things. And I think that's, that's not for nothing. That is a really actually a fairly remarkable step that it's part of the everyday development process within the companies. And I think it's certainly something to build on into. And one of the things we're doing at OEA is trying to illustrate that in more concrete ways, more tangible ways for other stakeholders to understand what's going on there. And like I said, the consultants that are involved in virtually every project at some level are committed to the WEGs as well, doing a lot of the same things that companies do in terms of embedding them in what they do. It's the way that they do it. It's the way that they do their business. It's very much for both developers and consultants a part of the business model, and that's like I said, not for nothing. So one other way to look at it is, what have the WEGs done in terms of creating framework for enhanced environmental review? And there's a couple ways to look at that. One is, even in the regulatory structures, whether state and federal, whether it's BEGIPA, which is the Vulnerable and Eagle Protection Act, or ESA, Endangered Species Act, there are the requirements that have to go through, regulatory requirements for that, and underlying those as a foundation to those are the wind energy guidelines and the process and the tiered process and decision making that go through that. So oftentimes you'll have the existence of a bird bat conservation plan that is part of a project's planning that is not directly required under ESA or other state laws, but it is something that the companies do. And the other thing is, it's created, not to say that the WEGs led directly to some efforts, some species and conservation related efforts, but they're certainly kind of point in that direction and give the framework, the structure, the need to do those. So that's everything from BUAC, which is the Bats and Wind Energy Collaborative, AWWI, which is American Wind and Wildlife Institute, AWIC, which is American Wind and Wildlife Information Center, and then most recently the Wind and Wildlife Research Fund, which is a collection, which is the industry getting together, aggregating funds, and saying, hey, let's solve some of these problems that we think we can really make some progress on if we were to get together. So that from those standpoints, the WEGs, the wind energy guidelines are we think providing a lot of benefit, and will continue to be a big part of the way that the industry conducts its business related to environmental review. Just put a finer point on that, the industry has always seen itself as a conservation partner. We're working all the way back with WCC, which was formed in 1994 and has continued to grow. Our companies have been, through various mechanisms, a part of those efforts and research that's done there. And then I mentioned a few of these as well as we go through, but just to kind of, in one picture, kind of show there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot the industry is involved in, that the industry is investing in, and whether it's direct funds or offering host sites or just participating in the research and the development of technology, the industry has been a part of a lot of those efforts. And then sort of finally here, I wanted to cover this again, going back to this point, the environmental benefits, why we're doing what we're doing, is important thing to me to bring in the conversation. Obviously, carbon is one of the big benefits that we're talking about here. I think many of you have seen the recent report by the Audubon, and then also I think Amy from Defenders of Wildlife talked about this on the first webinar series of the series, if you were on that. But the threats that climate change pose to habitats and to species is real, and wind energy, renewable energy is a big part. It's really hard to see a world in which we are able to control or limit the increased global temperatures without wind energy and without a fairly significant continued growth of wind energy. And I think that that's part of, when we say part of the environmental review, again, it's not to say, hey, don't worry about it. You need wind for carbon, but it is to say, these things have to be part of the bigger picture and the bigger evaluation of conservation of species and habitat. And, we're committed on both ends. And we think that the conversations that, again, were posed by at the AFWA level in the survey and continued interaction with the states is the way that I think we can get both sides of that equation and continue to go there. So,
all right, Mike.
that's all I have.
Is that the end?
That's
awesome.
good.
Sorry, I was trying to politely interrupt, so that's perfect, and that's a great way to end on that. So if we could have Rachel, Jessica, and Mike here, I'm assuming you're unmuted. We are going to ask a few questions, and if we don't have much time for questions, but if the audience wants to send us yours, and remember, any we won't cover, we're going to try to cover later. So I am going to start with Rachel. Given the release of the wind energy guidelines approximately 7 years ago, are there any plans to revisit them and potentially update them?
Thanks for that question. I'm glad to have a chance to answer it because I hear it a lot myself too. So we do feel it's important to continue to use best available science, and we did commit to keep the guidelines themselves updated. Just right now with all of the other priorities surrounding us in a regulatory perspective, this is not rising to the top of our list of priorities. And the fact, I think we did a good job in making the guidelines very adaptable and not written in stone. So because of that, I think that they're able to stand on their own, and folks can continue to seek best available information as new science is available. So at this point in time, we do not have any plans to revise or update the guidelines, but it's not a thing that we'll never look at. It's just not something that we have as a priority right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'm told we're out of time, but I want to run through quick questions. So Jessica, if you can answer this in a minute, do you know if AFWA has any plans to revisit the survey to see if there's been shifting trends?
Not that I'm aware of, nope. But the working group is working to implement some of the recommendations that I highlighted on that last slide and that are outlined in the summary report.
Thanks, Jessica. And then one quick one for Mike. Mike, if you could answer this quickly. Are there trainings that new industry environmental permitting managers can attend to get up to speed on wildlife issues and laws? Or are there trainings that you wish were available? Like I said, in 1 minute.
Yeah, there's a lot of components on there. I think, there are a couple of things. One is the siting conference, postponed siting conference. We're now being virtual in about a month or two's time. We will have a session related to wind energy guidelines there. And I did mention in the comments that as part of the research meeting in WCC, which I believe is December 1st to the 4th, Rachel and I will be working together to provide a session that talks about the wind energy guidelines anyway. So there are a couple of opportunities for that. I think you incorporate some other things in that question about policies and those kind of things, which I don't know if I have a quick answer to that, but could follow up offline.
All right. Well, thank you to the three of you all for participating. Really appreciate your engagement. Now we are going to shift to the second half of the webinar, which I'm really excited about, that we were able to get this suite of really incredible state agency representatives all together at once. The way this is going to work is I'm going to run through each of them one by one, and they're going to give a quick 5-minute presentation on what wind energy looks like in their state and how does that relate to wind energy and wildlife specifically. And so you can see we have Oregon up. So we're going to start with Sarah Wright, who's the Energy Program Coordinator at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Joy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sorry.
Great. So in Oregon, we're currently sitting somewhere around 3,400 megawatts of installed capacity. with an additional almost 4,000 megawatts in various stages of projects that are proposed or in review or are permitted and not yet built. Oregon is one of those states with an ambitious renewable portfolio standard. The goal is to have 50% of Oregonians using electricity from renewable sources, and those need to be mostly non-hydro by 2040. So this RPS, among some other factors, is helping drive the push for wind energy development in Oregon. Although I should also say that photovoltaic solar or projects that combine wind, solar, and battery storage are becoming increasingly prevalent. The permitting process for wind energy in Oregon depends on the size of the project. If the project is greater than 50 megawatts, the regulatory entity is the state, what is known as the Energy Facility Siting Council, or EFSEC for short, and that is staffed and administered by the Oregon Department of Energy, ODO. EFSEC projects are subject to a number of siting standards, including 2 that are specific to wildlife. In particular, the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Standard specifically references the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Habitat Mitigation Policy, which is an Oregon administrative rule. And so that provides ODFW, my agency, with a nexus for technical assistance, recommendations, and guidance. For projects that are less than 50 megawatts, the regulatory entities are Oregon's 36 counties. And county level projects are subject to some statewide planning goals and state rules, as well as local ordinances. And ODFW's nexus in the county level process, it's not as clearly defined as it is at the state level for those larger wind development projects. Next slide, please. ODFW's role in the permitting of wind energy is one of technical guidance. We're not regulatory here. We make recommendations to the regulatory agencies. All of our recommendations are guided by the ODFW Fish and Wildlife Habitat Mitigation Policy, which I mentioned earlier. And we use this framework regardless of the size of the project or regardless of the regulatory process. And our goal is to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to wildlife and their habitats. We try to provide the best available information and data that we can to assist with planning in as early of planning stages as possible. We have Oregon Compass, which is a online GIS decision support system. And hopefully more to come soon through OCAMP, which is the Oregon Connectivity Assessment Program, and ORISA, which is a new effort getting underway, and this is the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, a collaborative renewable energy planning effort funded through a Department of Defense grant. We also do have some regional guidance. The Columbia Plateau Wind Energy Guidelines, which were also developed in 2008, and that was a collaborative effort among the Oregon and Washington State Wildlife Agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the wind developers, the counties, the utilities, conservation groups, and Department of Energy. Priorities for us here in Oregon with regard to wind and wildlife right now, first and foremost, is growing our collaboration and our partnerships with industry, with our regulatory partners, and with the conservation community, as well as the research community. So we really appreciate being a part of this webinar and this whole series as a great step forward in building partnership. In our minds, the research and monitoring focus really needs to kind of pivot over to better understanding population level and cumulative effects of wind so as to better inform the guidelines and thresholds that we establish, and so that we all contribute to a better understanding of migratory pathways that will inform siting as well. We've been a strong supporter of the North American Bat Monitoring Program, NABAT, here in Oregon, and we're proud of our ongoing annual monitoring and partnership that we have with the Northwestern Bat Hub. We're very interested in leveraging these data and seeing how they can help inform wind development in our state. And we're also really interested in seeking opportunities to improve the information sharing channels between the state and industry, and see that as an ongoing conversation and some low-hanging fruit that we think we can work on collaboratively with our industry partners. And of course, the ongoing research and development, spectacular research going into the avoidance technologies, we see that also as really important work. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And so now I am going to turn it over to Tracy Labrandi Mumal, who's a wildlife biologist and habitat protection section chief at Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. So thank you, Tracy. Tracy, I don't think I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can. It's great.
Awesome. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, in Pennsylvania, we currently have 25 online wind facilities for a total of 751 turbines. We have a little over 1,400 megawatts installed, ranking us about 19th according to AWEA. Now, in Pennsylvania, we don't have a lot of development going on right now, and we haven't in the past few years. All but 2 of the 25 sites were conducted prior to 2014, so we've kind of hit a lull in the development of wind, which I'm not quite sure exactly why. I know some of it has to do with the tax credits, but and Pennsylvania doesn't have high capacity for wind development. So a lot of the good sites were already developed, so to speak. In terms of permitting, Pennsylvania is kind of unique in that not all of our wind or our wildlife agencies are housed under one roof. I work for the PA Game Commission. We have jurisdiction over birds and mammals, but there's 3 other agencies that cover the other wildlife in the state. So from a permitting perspective, our Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection issues permits, and they get recommendations from the other jurisdictional state agencies. And then it's up to the Department of Environmental Protection as to whether or not our recommendations make it into any permits moving forward. Since the Game Commission has jurisdiction over birds and mammals, when wind development was starting, you know, in the early 2000s, we had some concerns because it appeared that birds and bats were being impacted, and our existing environmental review system didn't take into consideration migratory pathways. So that caused some concerns for the agency. So you can go to the next slide. So we developed a voluntary wind energy cooperative agreement. And basically our goals were to protect birds and mammals, obviously. We knew that these migratory pathways weren't being considered in siting. We also knew that our current environmental review tool was missing some of these important criteria that we needed to consider. And we also knew there was a need for pre and post construction surveys to be done. And the developers would like to know before they develop a project, you know, what the agencies expect of them. So we actually got a group of wind developers together in addition to our staff and had several meetings and basically came up with this cooperative agreement. In 2007, it was adopted. We had a bunch of wind developers sign on, some that were in the process of developing wind in Pennsylvania, others who were thinking they were going to. After 5 years of having an agreement in place and working cooperatively with the wind developers, in 2013, we analyzed our first 5 years of data and we amended the agreement. We eliminated some surveys that we thought we needed them to do early on, but we realized they weren't giving us data that was really good in helping us make determinations for the wind sites. We revised some of our criteria for birds and mammals. A lot of the survey effort is based on risk level, and with white nose syndrome coming through during that time period, our bat populations decreased a lot, so we had to adjust our criteria. And we also incorporated a level of curtailment into our agreement. It's based on the project status, whether it's developed or in development or already existing, and also based on the risk of bat impacts from the project. So that's the quick and dirty view of the Game Commission's cooperative agreement. I did put the website for the agreement, the list of cooperators on this slide. So if anybody wants further information, they can go to the website. You can go to the next slide. One of the reasons why our cooperative agreement has been successful is that it brought the wind developers to the table from the start. I mean, we came with a list of what we would want them to do. They came with a list of what they are capable of doing, and we kind of met in the middle. it was a laborious process, but I think it was actually great because the agreement is implemented, the developers are using it, they are taking measures to reduce their impacts, they are improving where they're trying to site these wind sites in Pennsylvania. So I think it was a win-win for both sides. One of the benefits for signing on to our agreement is that the Game Commission, we don't cite the cooperators for fatalities if they are working with the Game Commission to help reduce them, to reduce their fatalities. So if they've already done everything they thought they could do to reduce their fatalities, but they're still having a higher level, then we won't cite them or give them a ticket or take them to court. We'll try to work and figure out a way to reduce those impacts moving forward. And the wind developers, I wanted to mention, they did like with the amended agreement that we allowed for flexibility for sites that were already existing, understanding that they already had power purchasing agreements, they already had commitments, and that they might not be able to implement a level of curtailment that our agency might want them to reduce their BAT impacts. So we have flexibility built in to work with those developers and determine what kind of technology they are using, how they may be able to help the situation. And the final thing I wanted to mention is the Game Commission does have state-owned lands within Pennsylvania. And since our jurisdiction is over birds and mammals, in 2018, we did adopt a resolution that we are not allowing any wind energy on our state lands. We do feel a conflict of interest. It's kind of against our mission and goals. We want to encourage birds and bats to use our state lands. So putting up wind turbines on our game lands isn't quite what we were thinking. So we did actually have a resolution saying that we won't be accepting any proposals on state lands, but there's still a ton of private lands in Pennsylvania where wind could be developed. And that's all I had for right now. Thanks for having me be a part of this webinar.
All right, thank you, Tracy. Everybody bear with me as I move through this presentation. So now I'm going to shift it over to Karen Voltura, who's the Energy Liaison and Land Use Specialist at Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to talk about wind energy in Colorado. So thank you, Karen.
Okay, well, good morning and well, good afternoon for many of you. My name is Karen Voltura. I'm one of 4 energy liaisons with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I cover the Southeast region, which is where the vast majority of our wind development is. Colorado currently ranks 7th for installed wind capacity with about 4,000 megawatts installed. Last year, wind generated about 25% of the electricity in Colorado. In 2020, I'm estimating that'll jump to about 30%. Growth in terms of installed capacity in megawatts and turbines has been fairly steady since, especially since 2010. In 2010 was when our renewable energy standards kind of set their current rates, which was a goal of 30% of electric generation from investor-owned utilities and 20% from cooperative utilities by the year 2020 from renewable energy sources. And here we are at 2020. This year we have almost 800 megawatts in construction for wind, and that's primarily in 2 counties. And we really don't expect that to slow. We have at least as much, I lost track, but we have like 12 projects in development at some stage talking to us, anywhere up to from 200 to 700 megawatts. The governor released a roadmap last year with a goal of 100% renewable electric generation aiming for 2040, and the largest utility in the state has the same goal for 2050. So we really don't think this is going to slow down. Next slide. Who regulates energy projects in Colorado? Not me. Colorado Parks and Wildlife is a recommending agency only when it comes to all energy and land use. So we have no regulatory role. The regulatory agencies are the Public Utility Commission at the state level. There are renewable energy standard rules for environmental impacts that require developers to consult with CPW and to incorporate the results of their surveys into their design and report out to Colorado Parks and Wildlife. But the specifics of that and the specifics related to compliance are not lined out in that. Local land use authority resides with the counties through state statute. And the counties vary in their local land use codes, what they consider when they look at wind projects, and the level of consultation with CPW during that permitting. These projects to date have all been on private lands, and there's tremendous economic benefit to both the county and the landowner. And along with our renewable energy goals for the state, it's a fairly favorable environment for development. What does consultation process look like then? We do consult. We do generally do very early consultations. We tend to meet with developers along with our partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offices in Denver. So we're on the same track, can know what each other is recommending, and then proceed on throughout the course of development and through the permitting process. Okay, next. This is just to give you some perspective. Colorado, everyone thinks mountains and skiing, and we do, but we have a significant amount of prairie habitat, and we're at the western edge of that Central Plains wind resource. Next slide. And this shows you the other direction. There should be a state slide. There we go. Sort of how the wind resource is distributed across the state. And you can see it's very concentrated in the Eastern Plains area. All of the blue dots are installed turbines. I think we're at about 2,700 thereabouts. And you can see that even though we have a lot of installed capacity, it's pretty much in 6 different counties. Those central projects are along I-70, and so there's a good corridor and transmission into the Front Range where a lot of the population resides. And along the Wyoming border to the north, again, you have proximity to Fort Collins and some of the cities down the central part of the state. If you look in the far southeast corner, that's really where we're seeing a lot of current interest going. And you can see the wind resource is fairly good down there. It's a very long transmission corridor from there. But the other concern, if you can go to the next slide, one of our big sighting concerns are lesser prairie chickens. The map that's inset there shows their range in Colorado. We're one of 5 states within their range. They are a state threatened bird. They've been federally listed, delisted, proposed for relisting, and the federal decision is coming next year. But the focal areas, which are red in the map, are high priority for our conservation efforts, and you can see it overlaps pretty significantly with the wind resource. And habitat loss and fragmentation is one component of our concerns with that, and the other are indirect impacts through behavioral avoidance. They are known to avoid tall structures, the level at which really isn't very known. They're not well studied with wind anyways, but their behavioral avoidance is documented in other, particularly power lines and oil and gas. And there's also cumulative impacts for these species. Wind's not the only concern. We do have oil and gas development on the landscape. And the population level is somewhat stable, but it's far below the goals for the species. And the concern is these low populations are also susceptible to drought and severe climate impacts. And then lastly, the last slide, one of our other sighting concerns has to do with raptors, and particularly golden eagles. And we also have ferruginous hawks, which are a state species of concern out on the plains. There's direct risk from collision risk, but also habitat loss and fragmentation, not just from the wind farms, but those really long transmission corridors, sometimes 100, 120 miles to connect from that far southeast corner. Prey base is also an issue. Prairie dogs, they're a fairly contentious management issue in the western states. However, they support a lot of other species out on the plains, and so we look pretty closely at them. We have black-footed ferret reintroduction sites. Mountain plovers, swift fox, burrowing owls are all part of the suite of species kind of supported by the prairie dogs. We're also managing plague out on the plains. And so again, all these cumulative impacts, and if prairie dog colonies are sort of collateral damage from development, it has some cascading impacts. So because we're recommending only, we have to sort of try to take into these whole suite of things when we're working with developers on our consultation. So we also have more issues than that, but those are the 2 we really work with, particularly with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you, Karen. And those are 2 of the species that will be covered on our upcoming webinars. So it's a perfect way to tee us up. All right, now I'm going to shift over to our final state representative, who is Erin Hazelton, who is the Wind Energy and Wildlife Administrator at Ohio Division of Wildlife. So thank you, Erin.
Thanks very much, Joy, and hello everyone out there listening. Thank you for taking some time to tune in here. I'm going to give Ohio's perspective on what's going on with wind energy in my state. So next slide, please, Joy. And just an overview of energy production in Ohio. Really, it's still very dominated by fossil fuels, but we do have a small contingent of renewables. And 60% of what you see there is made up of wind, which roughly equates to about 3% of Ohio's households. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea of where all that's located in the state, mostly north and northwestern Ohio. And on this map, you can see the location of our wind farms. The green outlined projects are those that are currently operating. The orange are those that have been approved, and if they have hashes, it means that they're currently under construction as of May of this year. And then the red outlined projects are those that are currently being reviewed for siting through the Power Siting Board. And I'll talk about more of that in a second. Next slide. And just to summarize what all that is, just to give you an idea of what we have in the state, really we're generally right in the middle as far as the country goes for developed wind. I have about 719 megawatts right now operating. And in the next year, I imagine we're going to almost double that, 688 additional megawatts. And then those pending projects, the ones that were in red, another 650. So essentially what we have on the ground is a third of what we're going to have in the next 2 to 10 years. And so in total, again, projecting that out somewhere around 2,000 megawatts, if not a bit more, depending on what projects come on and fall off. Next slide. So about our renewable energy policy, we've kind of been all over the place in Ohio. In 2008, we did have a renewable portfolio established, but then last year in 2019, essentially the targets were lowered and then eventually completely eliminated. So right now, I know there's some draft policy floating around out there, but I'm not aware of anything that has really made it too far in the scheme of things yet, especially with everything else that's been coming out with COVID, et cetera. Next slide. So ODNR's role. So similar to what we heard from, we don't have any direct regulatory authority, but instead we work with our Public Utility Commission, which has a board called the Power Siting Board. And any wind project that's 5 megawatts or larger and connected to the public grid has to go through a review process and get permitted through the state. And on that board, there's 11 members, and the director of ODNR, Natural Resources, is one of those members. So that's how they're able to review some of these projects. And staff, so myself, for instance, we're able to provide the technical support and offer guidance recommendations to the board on these projects. And then sometimes, depending on what it is, those recommendations can be included in that operating certificate, which is binding upon the company. And then finally, of course, US Fish and Wildlife is also involved in Ohio if there's a federal nexus that's triggered. Next slide, please. So we are fortunate in that we've had some pre and post construction protocols laid out before wind even was developed in the state. And I have to thank my predecessors for all this. I had nothing to do with this at all. But essentially what you see here is a model that was created, and it outlines a level of survey effort pre-construction that should be done depending on where an energy company would like to come in and site their project. So for instance, most of our projects are currently located in the green areas, which is a minimum survey effort and presumably a lower risk. And so those, you can see the surveys that would be required for pre-construction. If a company wanted to locate a little bit further into the yellow or orange, then they would have to do a cumulative, the minimum and the moderate, all the way down to extensive. So again, we do get consultation early with a lot of these companies because these surveys are required through the Power Siting Board application process. So again, we're very fortunate to work early and often with the wind energy companies and help identify some of those risks that they may not be aware of before they really get too far down the process. Next slide, please. So this is just an aerial of what Ohio looks like. I imagine it's not too much of a surprise for folks with where our wind energy is being developed. And essentially it's farmland with some woodlots scattered about. And proposed construction surveys for 2 years, the companies and their consultants are required to survey under every turbine for fatalities, and then also do breeding bird surveys and bat acoustics. And so they report all of that on an annual basis to us, and then from there we're able to identify some trends and make recommendations. So that's kind of at the point we are right now, and I'd like just to share with you some of the trends that we're noticing with our with some of the wind companies that we've had, at least on the landscape, for about 10 years now. So I'll go to the next slide. So bird fatalities, again, it varies from year to year, but an estimate anywhere from 2 to 12 birds per turbine. And then also, this is kind of the composition of what we typically see in Ohio. So a lot of the birds, I would say, 2/3 are those birds that live in farmland, which makes a lot of sense. Our horned larks and our killdeer. We may even be making habitat for them by putting in those pads and roads and clearing out some of the land to put in the turbines. So we do see a lot of mortality with those species. And then the other third essentially is made up of passerines, of our songbirds. And really the majority of this occurs in spring and fall migration. Next slide, please. And the bat fatalities, a little bit different. We have about 4 to 34 bats per turbine per year estimated. And with the bats, of course, we don't have as many bat species as we do bird species, but the majority of the mortality is comprised of 4 different species: the big brown, the red bat, the hoary, and the silver-haired. And again, those percentages vary from year to year, but the trend is very similar every year. It's going to be these 4 that really we see the majority of mortality. And again, I'll point out that all these estimates are taken when there's a 6.9 meter a second curtailment during the spring and fall migration season. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarize here, currently we have 340 turbines, and these are the estimates for birds and for bats per year. So again, looking at these trends internally, now that we do have, at least 5 or so years of data, we feel like we're starting to see some patterns. And we are in Ohio really concerned about birds and bats during migration. So I think we're going to see if there's any way that we can try to get some of those numbers a little bit lower and be a little bit more conscientious about that. Again, migration is difficult and it's difficult to study. So we're always, looking to further our research into this as well. Next slide, please. Future trends, the state, about half of the state or a third of the state is generally favorable for wind right now. This is at 80 meter hub height. As technology gets better, we're seeing it right now. The turbines are getting larger, the nacelle is taller, so they're able to, develop projects where before it may not have been feasible to put in a wind farm. So I do think that trend will continue and we'll see increased development throughout the state. So along with that, I think, with the state focus, we're really going to try to learn a little bit more about the impacts to birds and bats, and especially during migration. And we're always open to all the different technologies that are, out there and under development right now. So, as far as that goes with the state, we're open to seeing how that could be applied to the turbines in Ohio. And I think that's all I have for the next.
Great. Just about to wrap up. So thank you, Erin. So I want to ask our speakers if they're willing to, or the state panelists, to all put on their webcams and join Erin. And we're going to do a quick panel. I have some quick prepared questions for our panelists, but then we also encourage the audience to submit your comments because we're hoping to go there. All right, so I'm going to start with Tracy. And Tracy, and for everyone who knows my team, Defenders of Wildlife, they will expect this one. It relates to non-listed bats. I loved hearing about the voluntary cooperative agreement and the history in Pennsylvania. I thought that was remarkable. And I was curious, can you talk a little bit more about your collaboration with industry on non-listed bats that are a priority?
Yeah, I definitely can. When we first had our cooperative agreement, we were looking, some of the triggers were threatened and endangered species that were state listed. And then as the data was coming in, and which is holding true to, it appears what is in Ohio too, you have a lot of these migratory tree bats, which none of those are listed in Pennsylvania. So that kind of caused a little bit of an issue for us, because we thought initially it was going to be the state listed species we're going to have to worry about. So yeah, I mean, we did have 5 years of data. We looked at it. We've kind of taken a more overall approach to bat impact. Yes, we are still concerned with state listed species, but some of our curtailment recommendations that we give to higher risk sites are basically to help protect all the bats that we have in the state. So when migrating through, the ones that are, you know, the hibernating caves, like all the species. So our developers have been pretty cooperative with that since we revised our amended agreement. The new sites that have come online have implemented some level of curtailment from the start, even those that weren't high risk. So I think that is a success story, whether it's feathering their blades when they weren't before, or implementing curtailment at a lower meters per second than like 6.9. I know a lot of the sites just don't want to do the 6.9, but they can incorporate curtailment at 4 meters per second. So we're encouraging the various developers to do that, and they seem to be on board for it.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Now going to move to Sarah in Oregon. So you talked about how Oregon has been proactively engaging on renewable energy planning, such as through the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment. Can you speak to your state's motivations behind the approach and how you think it will be used for permitting or overseeing wildlife responsible wind energy in the future?
All right, so the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, or ORESA, it's a planning project. It came to us through a $1.1 million grant from Department of Defense. It's being led by the Oregon Department of Energy, Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Oregon State University. The project's going to collect information on 3 topic-focused compatibility assessments, and those are the renewable energy market and an industry assessment, military needs, and an impact assessment to military mission, and then a renewable energy resource and natural resource mapping effort to look at constraints and opportunities. And the goal is to create kind of a more transparent and consistent collection of information about renewable energy and transmission, to look at where the development opportunities and constraints are, and to just inform discussions and inform planning. And for ODFW, for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, it improves the information sharing between all of the players so that we can collectively make the best decisions possible. From a natural resource perspective, hopefully we can reduce conflict and avoid some of the crucial areas, crucial habitats and crucial populations. But at the same time, finding those opportunities to facilitate Oregon's transition to renewable energy development and promoting those economic development opportunities. So we see it as kind of a win-win, just a first step of putting all the information on the table and making it available to everyone.
Thanks. We're really excited, I know, at Defenders to see what comes out of that. So now I'm going to shift to Erin in Ohio. And Erin, you discussed the review and permitting process the state has for wind energy. And I think that's a little unique from what we see in some states. Can you talk a little bit about how that permitting process is reducing wind wildlife impacts and how it aligns with your division's wildlife priorities for the future that you listed out?
Sure. Well, after listening to some of the presentations, I'm not sure it's that unique anymore, but essentially we're one of those states that the legislative authority rests with our Public Utilities Commission, and DNR, which who I work for, has a seat on that board, so we help to advise the board. And I would have to say that this works really well because the application process is streamlined this way, and the company, while they definitely consult with DNR, everything is really funneled through the Power Siting Board, through our Public Utilities Commission. And that application process is very extensive, and the ecological resources and wildlife resources are just a very small part, as Michael mentioned, of what goes into a siting project. So really, I think that through that, we're able to address some of the potential issues with wildlife through the authority of our Power Siting Board, and as well as maintain relationships with the wind energy industry and the companies that operate in Ohio, and work with them into the future on these projects as well.
Sorry, mute button, but thanks, Erin. All right, well, now we will be shifting gears. Maybe Karen, you're the one that's not unique, as you talked about the local regulatory authority in Colorado. So in light of that, how do you engage with wind developers and inform wind development, even though the regulatory authority is localized?
I think there's a few things you can do. One is the PUC does require them, they have to come talk to us. So we try to take advantage of that early consultation while we have their attention. And one of the ways we do too is really consistent, and that they know if they're in lesser prairie chicken habitat, that this is what we're going to ask for. So we have state guidelines and standards that are pretty consistent and best management practices across the industry. I think that's one. We've tried to be creative in some other ways, and one is some of the utilities are putting out big requests for proposals, and they all had to put in their, their CPW consultation, and they did it sort of late in the game. We're asking some of those utilities, can you bring these in earlier? If you're going to require that, or require it earlier in the process. We're also working with different agencies. Our state land board recently passed a stewardship action plan for lesser prairie chickens to kind of help us with those efforts, so we get early consultation on their leases in areas in that habitat. I also think just from a conservation standpoint, we just need to continue to do our work, because we're working really hard to recover lesser prairie chickens, because the more we have on the landscape, the less every individual lek is critical. We have 7 active leks, every single one of them counts. We get up into the 20s and 30s, I think we get a little more flexibility. So it is those relationships, with that. It's also working with, landowners and communities, and there's a huge economic benefit, and the state is, putting this forward as, for their climate goals, and we support that, and finding some equivalent value for these conservation of species that we're looking at. And again, getting conservation efforts on the ground to sort of balance out what we're doing. And I think you just have to be creative, and you have to look for those little things that matter. Cumulative impacts are really hard to address without a regulatory capacity, but you just have to take every little win you can get, and every little cooperative agreement you can get with every turbine they move further from a lek is a win, and you have to sort of add those up.
I love that perspective, Karen. So thank you. So we're going to switch now back to bats. I promise this wasn't my question. And so one of the audience members wants to know, are there any states that are requiring bat minimization as a requirement? I guess we'll put for for any bats. And second, are you seeing adoption of deterrence in your state? I don't know who wants to address that. Tracy, I guess you spoke a little to it, so if you want to reiterate.
Yes. You can hear me? Yep, okay. Yeah, in terms of requiring some level of curtailment, the Game Commission can't require it. Our permitting system, and we don't issue any kind of permits, so we're just hoping they're going to incorporate some kind of level of curtailment with these cooperative agreements we have with them. So yeah, it's a slippery slope. There's some compromise involved. We, like Karen was saying, every little bit we get, we consider a little victory if we can work with them to do just a little bit here and there. What was the second part of the question?
Have you seen a wide uptick in deterrent technology, or any, I guess, deployed in Pennsylvania?
In Pennsylvania, they've actually done some research on various techniques other than just using, your standard curtailment, but we haven't seen them implemented. We've some of our wind sites have been the sites of research, but not any kind of mass implementation on the sites they were actually researched on. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why they don't want to implement them if they're finding they work. So.
Thanks, Tracy. Also, you've frozen a little in a good place though, so you might want to turn on and off your webcam. Thank you. Erin, I know you mentioned bats in your presentation. Are you seen minimization requirements or cooperative agreements on minimization or deterrence?
Right. So in Ohio, I mentioned we have a 6.9 meter a second curtailment that's required pretty much for all of our wind farms for spring and for fall. But that comes through the Fish and Wildlife Service because of the risk of Indiana bats, which we've had mortality at during the spring and the fall for Indiana bats. So that's established by them. And the state really doesn't have, we haven't really mandated any sort of additional curtailment at this time. But part of our process is, through the Power Siting Board, there's usually a condition or something that speaks to if there's a significant mortality event, there'll be some sort of mitigation plan, and the company will continue to work with DNR to address the issue. So through that, we're exploring, different ways, smart curtailment, what technologies might be available, that type of thing. So it is an evolving conversation that hopefully involves more than just simple curtailment.
Thanks, Erin. All right, so we'll shift away from bats, and I'm gonna direct this, I guess, to Sarah and then Karen. We heard a lot about the wind energy guidelines, and I realize those are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services guidelines. But I was curious, what's the intersection with those guidelines in your state? Does Oregon rely? Do you look at them, or how does it intersect?
Yeah, we certainly use and rely on and invoke the wind energy guidelines, and as Michael pointed out, it's so ingrained in industry standards at this point. They come to the table kind of operating within that framework already, and that's very helpful. It certainly has made it so that there's awareness and acceptance of the need to be paying attention to pre-construction surveys and post-construction surveys. It is complementary to our existing regulations and guidelines that we have here in Oregon. Where I think there's opportunity for improvement is just in how we implement those together, and things like that Jessica brought up, the timing and substance of consultation, having that occur as early as possible, and what happens with state input once it's provided. How we can better share information and learn from that information. So we are grateful for the WEGs. We're very cognizant of the fact that they are voluntary and what that means, and are just looking for opportunities to improve implementation.
Thanks, Sarah. Karen, same question for you.
Yeah, like I said, most of our consultations in Colorado take place in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Service consultations on projects, particularly early on. And so that framework kind of model, or it molds our discussions as well. Ours sort of break out in maybe different priorities, whereas at least Fish and Wildlife Service right now is really focused here on golden eagles. And we are as well, and we actually have the database for golden eagle nests in Colorado that we help them with. So I think there's a good collaboration there. Whereas right now we're looking from a management perspective at some other species that aren't necessarily something that the feds are prioritizing. And it's just time, it's staffing, so I think in one way it works because we're sort of dividing up the topics and kind of approaching it holistically as long as we're having the same conversation. So certainly that does, because we're sort of co-consulting at the same time, it does frame what we do, but it does give us sort of consistent surveys so we can you could cite a lot of those projects were kind of clumped together. We could take information from the projects and kind of look across lines on that. So it does really guide what we talk with until we get to the specifics where we might have more detailed conversations in terms of on-site planning.
Thanks, Karen. First of all, going to see, did we lose Tracy?
I'm still on the phone.
Oh, perfect. I just wanted to make sure you were still there. And I guess I will, Tracy and Erin, do either of you guys want to elaborate what Karen and Sarah provided regarding the wind energy guidelines in your state?
Tracy, would you like to go first, and I'll follow up?
Yeah, sure. The wind energy guidelines for most of the Pennsylvania wind sites, the developers are using them more as a checklist And they are going through the process of looking at things. I don't know how well they are being used to better site projects. And I say that just because some of the high-risk sites that the Game Commission has deemed high risk for birds and or bats, we were able to kind of deter development of those in the past, and they seem to be coming back around again. And they're using the wind energy guidelines and saying they're following them. But I think it's more like a checklist opposed to, you know, looking at them to see how they can better site the project. So there's definitely a disconnect between what's required on the federal level or what's recommended on the federal level and versus the state level in Pennsylvania to a certain degree. But, you know, we work with all the developers to try to work through any of those misconceptions. So a lot of times they think that if they're doing something based on the wind energy guidelines, that will suffice for the wind energy voluntary cooperative agreement we have in Pennsylvania, which at times it doesn't, and we require a little bit more. So.
Thanks, Tracy. I would say that Ohio's experience with the WEGs is very similar to yours as well. However, because we have the power siting board process through our Public Utility Commission, I think that really steps in and helps to guide, you know, what's required and when it's required and what the siting looks like. So I think that's really takes the place of the WEGs in many cases for projects in Ohio.
Thank you, everyone. Those were great, robust answers. I now have a pretty specific question for Sarah. Sarah, has the 50 megawatt cutoff for state involvement through FSEC led to more or less developers focusing on projects that are smaller?
There used to be a time, I think similar to Tracy and what others have said, most of our existing and built wind facilities, they've been around for several years now. We have not seen very many new applications in the last couple of years. The shift is definitely trending toward PV solar. So I haven't in the last several years seen people try to slip projects under that 50 megawatt threshold. It used to be lower. It used to be a 35 megawatt threshold until fairly recently. But in the past, and this is an issue across both wind and PV solar, we will see several small projects get proposed in close proximity to each other, sometimes same landowner or sometimes the same parent wind developer doing business as a couple of different smaller companies. So yeah, that is happening to a certain extent where they try to avoid the more robust state permitting process. But we also see just as much, if not more, of, especially from the larger wind development companies, knowing that just going for one larger singular permit for a larger facility is almost in some cases lower risk, I guess. I'm sure there's a lot of things that go into the calculus for them, but it's kind of a more comprehensive process that they know all their site is going to get approved at one time, rather than having several sites going through separate permitting processes that might be subject to different issues. So that pattern of behavior has shown up in the past. I haven't seen it much on wind recently.
Interesting. Thanks, Sarah. All right, this question is for Tracy. Tracy, you mentioned in your presentation how you were adaptively managing your cooperative agreements and policies. Can you give any examples of how that's evolved through time based on what you've learned?
I mean, we've only done one revision to the cooperative agreement based on the first 5 years of data. And honestly, since we did the amendment, wind energy development has slowed in the state. So we haven't. If anybody goes to our webpage, we did do some summary reports. The last one was issued in 2012. And we haven't done one since, mostly because we've only had 2 sites get online, and both of those sites were implementing some level of curtailment So they were, some of the protocols, since we revised the protocols, the data sets couldn't be looked at exactly the same because we were looking at some different factors. But we were very happy with, the wind developers moving forward over the last few years, even the ones that have been coming to the table in the last couple of years with proposed projects, although none of them go into construction, they are trying to bring to the table from the start early. They're consulting with us early, which is great. We're working through the curtailment. What are they capable of from the start, and how that will affect their post-construction monitoring. I did have a site that they were willing to do a higher level of curtailment from the start once they went online. And I said, if you're going to do that, then we can release you of your post-construction surveys. So we have been compromising where we can for those developers that are coming to the table, trying to do the right thing from the beginning. Instead of trying to implement those measures after the fact, which is harder for them to do. And at that point, we've already lost bats, birds. I'd rather start from the beginning and have that reduced risk from day one. So I think those are some of our success stories.
That's awesome. Thanks, Tracy. It's great to see that you guys keep at it and evolving those documents that can get kind of static. The next question, I'm going to start with Karen, because you talked about grouse. And this isn't necessarily specific to grouse, but what do you think are some of the largest research gaps with respect to wind wildlife, and where would you prioritize investments in research?
I think the gaps that we identified in the survey and kind of in our group are these cumulative impacts, these landscape level impacts. And for us, most of the work in lesser prairie chickens has been done on oil and gas, and there's not that much of it, as opposed to with greater prairie chickens, everything's been done on wind. And we really think that it's not a natural conclusion that they're going to behave equally in terms of their landscape and all of that. So I think those individual level landscape habitat questions, and particularly the indirect impacts of, I'm a behavioral ecologist, so I'm a little biased, but that behavior of these animals in response to this and the population level impacts of that, I think are pretty key. I didn't mention bats. We do have bats on the Eastern Plains, and our focus right now from a state, instead of, not so much in sighting, but is, like Sarah said with NA bat, we were one of the early participants in that program, and really understanding the distribution of those species on the landscape and what impacts we do have influence the population kind of level impacts. And I think those components are pretty difficult to handle when you're looking one project at a time. And I think as a state, and I think we should be pursuing opportunities to get more of that information at sort of that large scale. And I think interstate partnerships are great, like the lesser prairie chicken, the 5 state working groups, kind of understanding those kind of broader programs help states communicate with each other and share information. I think those are pretty key to support going forward.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you for also mentioning bats. Bats are a West and an East Coast issue, so I didn't mean to unintentionally allude to that. We're big bat fans, obviously, here. Sarah, if you want to go next, what do you see as the biggest research gaps and priorities?
Yeah, I think Karen hit on it. The hardest part of this for me are just the unknowns about population level effects and cumulative effects. It's my job to sustain wildlife populations and make recommendations that'll help sustain wildlife populations despite wind energy development, despite other land use changes, and yet I face these really big unknowns. So I think there's been really great work done on perfecting, survey methodology and statistical design to estimate fatality rates, and I would just like to see perhaps a pivot more toward kind of compiling all of our information and taking a look at what the population level effects are. Hoary bats are a species of particular concern for us here out west, and we're starting to detect some declining trends in population here in Oregon. I'd like to further explore what contribution wind energy development has to that trend. I'm certain it's not the only thing contributing, but kind of more of this population level look, which I know is you know, disconcerting and challenging from an industry perspective, to, especially when you're just trying to get one project approved, to then bear the burden and responsibility of all of the cumulative effects for past projects, you know, bearing the burden of sins of the past, if you will. But I do think that's where we need to head, where we need to start looking. And then also very interested in ongoing work with BATAMP and elsewhere to begin to understand where our migratory pathways might be for bats. I think that's something that would be worthy of putting some energy and effort into.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. I'm now going to pass out to Erin. Research gaps and priorities.
Wow, I don't really know that I can add too much more to what's already been said. Sarah, very well put. I would have to agree with that completely as well for Ohio. And specifically, you know, bats and migration. I mean, bats are so difficult to study already, and then they fly at nighttime, places we don't know they fly. So it's inherently difficult. And I think that any little bit of information that we have that can help is important. So we may not have the whole picture. But I don't think that should cripple our ability to make decisions going forward as far as how to best protect the resource. So I think that's kind of where Ohio is and where I hope that we go as well as a state, and then also, you know, as a country, a region, a country, whatnot. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges to tackle, and it's going to take a bunch of us coming together to kind of put our heads together and figure it out.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'd also like to clarify that bats were not discussed in planning this state panel, but it's definitely a recurring theme. Tracy, finally, you research priorities and gaps.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody else is saying with the cumulative effects. I think one of the concerns I've always had is for bats and birds, you know, they're following these migratory pathways, some of which we know, some we don't. But what happens when they're flying from Canada down to South America and they're following ridges through Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio and other places? So I think the talking with the various states is helpful to figure out what's going on a bigger picture, on a cumulative effect. I mean, some of these species are having to go through a gauntlet of obstacles in terms of wind energy. If you're thinking about all the wind turbines they might have to navigate through during migration. So I think the bigger picture questions definitely, and also the behavior of these bats. Some of the curtailment that wind sites have implemented are really good at reducing certain species from being killed, but not others. So it's kind of interesting to me to look at those, you know, why are these migratory tree bats still getting killed at such great numbers, even though there's some curtailment being implemented at these sites? Why is it working for some species and not for other bat species? So I think both of those are two research topics that I would like to see tackled.
All right, that's great. So thank you, everyone. Those were really well thought out responses. So we are down to 2 minutes, and this has been such an amazing panel. I know I've learned a lot. I was curious from our 4 panelists in 2 minutes if there was anything else that you really want the listeners to know about your job, your role, states, wind and wildlife. Have we covered it all?
Well, I can, you know, I think I mentioned sort of that baseline conservation, and I think our entire agency, and a big thank you to them for all they participate and all of the times I bug them for things. I think it really takes a broad perspective to look at all the pieces of this, and, you know, state agencies are fairly, you know, widespread agencies and a lot of specialties, and we try to take advantage of all of that and, you know, remain true to our mission while, you know, working within the broader perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. You guys are definitely in a tough spot.
I'll just chime in real quick.
I just wanted to
Oh, sorry, Tracy. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I don't know if that was Tracy, but I'll just say, I just wanted to say thank you to NREL and Defenders of Wildlife and to the attendees for having me here today, having us here today. it's great to have the opportunity to have the states participate in this conversation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with industry and with other stakeholders and partners. Appreciate being here.
Thanks, Sarah. And also didn't want to cut you off, Erin, for last remarks. No pressure.
No, it's okay. I think that we're seeing a lot of collaborative efforts spin off in the last couple of years, and I think that's the direction that it's going to be heading in the next few years as far as the next steps. So I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of all of these different efforts. Some of the ones that we heard in the first part of the presentation. So again, yes, thank you for having me on this panel. I've learned a lot as well, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Erin, that is a perfect way to end this, so thank you. And thank you to all 4 of you. I know you guys put in a lot of effort to be here, so thanks. And Bethany, I think with that, we will wrap it up. All right, well, thank you all.